All right, no basketball today. Like I said, we'll get back to football talk. For today, we'll do basketball talk again. If any as things come up, as things sort of emerge and come out. Next Monday's the opening of the transfer portal for basketball, so certainly there'll be a lot of news leading into that day and coming out of that day as Pitt players make the decision to leave the team, and Pitt expresses interest in certain players in the transfer portal and ultimately lands some of them. We'll have plenty to talk about as those things come to pass. But for now, it's back to football because Pitt will be back in the South Side this morning for practice number 4 of Spring Camp 2025. They practiced Tuesday and Thursday last week. They had a Saturday practice that was closed to the media, put on pads for the first time, and they'll be back in the South Side for practice today. Practice number 4, like I say, they'll be in full pads. Again, they'll practice Tuesday, Thursday this week. Next week, they'll practice Monday, Thursday. They moved their Tuesday practice back to Monday because the team, as Pat Narduzzi told us last week, the team's going to be going out to Indianapolis for Mason Alexander's memorial ceremony. And so they moved that Tuesday practice back to Monday. They'll have pro day on Wednesday, practice Thursday, practice Saturday. Do it again the next week, and then do it again the following week with the Saturday practice being the Blue Gold game. So there's 5 weeks of spring camp. This is the start of week 2 today, and I figured we could talk about some of the big topics that we're interested in this week. Some of the things I'm going to be paying particular attention to, some of the things we're going to be asking about, some of the things we're going to be writing about. Let's preview them right here. What are the big storylines for Pitt football entering week 2 of spring camp? Let's break it down here on the Morning Pitt, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. It's a Tuesday edition of the Morning Pitt, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Tuesdays and Thursdays are busy days for us. Certainly, as we move through the day, a lot of things to do, but also a busy day on the website at Panther-Lair.com. We'll have a lot of coverage of spring camp this morning, photos, videos, interviews, write-ups. We have our spring camp reports, which I think are probably more insight than you're going to get anywhere else on spring camp, so I highly recommend checking those out. Hopefully you took advantage of our special offer that we had yesterday. It ended yesterday, I should say, where you got 75% off your first year subscription to Panther-Lair.com. If you missed that, we might be able to conjure up another little promo for you, but it's not going to be as good as 75%, so hopefully you took advantage of that. And if you didn't, get on the next promo before that one runs out, and you get an even worse deal after that. So make sure you come and check it out, Panther-Lair.com. We're on the 24/7 Sports Network right now. That's why we're running promos, trying to get you guys to come and check it out. It's the same great Pitt coverage you've always come to know and love, just in a new place with some new buttons to push and new fancy tricks and things like that. And in addition to a great team of national recruiting analysts who've been giving us some great coverage throughout the 2+ weeks that we've been part of the 24/7 Sports Network. It's been exciting. It's been fun. And hopefully you're joining us over there at Panther-Lair.com. We talked through the first week of spring camp about this topic and that topic. We talked about Eli Holstein. We obviously talked about a lot about the offensive line. We talked about some of the other big topics that were sort of facing Pitt as they entered spring camp. And you got, all that we talked about last week was all sort of based on the first 2 practices. And the first 2 practices were not in pads. And so, what are you really getting? You're getting sort of a general sense of how these guys size up, getting a general sense of how they line up, and getting a general sense of sort of what they look like next to each other. But now we're moving into week 2. Into week 2, they've got full pads. They're going to be doing some full live drills, hitting, and some real football practice. And I think you start getting a little bit better of a sense of the team at this point, of who's where, who's in what order, and where they are, just in the grand scheme of things, as the team sort of moves through these 15 practices of spring camp. And so this week, I got some things that I'm really interested in. And this is in no particular order. It's a couple of offensive ones, a couple of defensive ones. And the first one is the running back depth. And we talked to Pat Narduzzi about this a little bit last week, about who's your number 2 back. They've got, obviously, Desmond Reed coming back after an All-American season. Look, he pops up on the screen right when I talk about him. That's perfect. He's coming back after an All-American season where I think he was exceptional. I think he exceeded certainly any expectations anyone outside the building had. Maybe inside the building they believed he could be an All-American. But, on the outside, I think we all thought well, he could be good, but let's see how he does with that transition from FCS to FBS. Well, he did just fine with it. As a matter of fact, he was awesome and was arguably the team's best overall player, certainly the best offensive player. You could have a debate with him and Kyle Lewis for the team's best overall player through the course of last season. But he was the best offensive player. He was the most explosive offensive weapon. And he was a guy who literally could turn any play into a big gain. And I mean, they win that Cal game on the strength of a lot of plays, not the least of which was his handoff on 4th and 1 that goes 70-some yards for a touchdown, right? And that's the kind of game-breaking ability he has. So you know he's coming back, and you're in good shape there. But it's a big question mark after that. Daniel Carter's out of eligibility. Montravius Lloyd transferred, although who even knew? Derek Davis got hurt in the Boston College game with an injury that Pat Narduzzi says he hopes Davis is back for training camp in August. So you're not getting Derek Davis back at all this spring. You're probably not going to get those sort of early midsummer workouts in. They're hoping he can come back for training camp in August, which puts him on a timeline that doesn't exactly bode well for him being ready to participate as the number 2 running back this season. And so who is? Well, it's Juelz Goff. And Pat Narduzzi said it, showed some good things late in the season. Certainly in the bowl game, I think he played pretty well. Narduzzi agreed with that. And I think you probably feel pretty comfortable about Juelz Goff as the backup running back to Desmond Reed heading into this season. The question is that enough? And I think what's really interesting has been the early spring camp emergence of Ja'Carrion Turner. I guess they call him Boozy. I guess that's his nickname. But he has impressed the coaches through the first week of spring camp. Pat Narduzzi mentioned that to I've heard it in a couple different places. He said it publicly last week on Thursday during his press conference that Turner has been turning some heads and making a lot of plays. The thing about Ja'Carrion Turner is he's sort of built a lot like Desmond Reed and Juelz Goff. Not that all those guys have the exact same body type or build or height or weight, but stop me if you've heard this one before. He's small and fast. And this coaching staff, this offensive staff is truly putting all of its money on the idea, whatever your speed-based cliche there is. You can't teach speed, there's no substitute for speed. I'll take small and fast over big and slow any day. I don't know if that's a cliche, but I just invented it. I'm putting it in there. But, that general idea of if I have my choice between the bigger, slower guy or the smaller, faster guy, give me the speed, because the speed is what can ultimately change a game. And I think it's valid. I think there's some, I don't know if it's the be-all, end-all, but I think there's some legitimacy to that way of thinking. I think if you can get receivers or running backs who any play they can go 80 yards, they might not get 4 yards every time. They might not be able to just push the pile and pick up a handful of yards, but that ability to break games open, it's kind of it's invaluable. And it can be frustrating. It can feel like things aren't working when handoff after handoff after handoff is only getting 1 yard or minus 1 yard or 2 yards, and it's not really doing enough to get consistent wins on first down that help you set up manageable second and third downs. But if every 8 to 10 of those carries is offset with one that goes for 50, well, okay, you take that. Now all of a sudden you've upped that yards per carry considerably. You've upped that, for the individual and for the team. You're not getting it on a consistent basis, but that one play can break a game open. And if you have a couple of those guys, and really even one, Desmond Reed is capable of doing that multiple times a game, breaking a run that's 40, 50, 60, 70 yards. He is. And if you have a few guys who can do that, now you're looking at an offense that has a lot of explosiveness and the potential to score from any point on the field, particularly when you add in the wide receivers, who, again, seem to be in that same mold, that small but fast mold. It's not the worst way to go, particularly if you feel like you can find a market inefficiency where, other coaches are too obsessed with size and they'll count somebody out because they're too small. There was the old joke back when Dion Lewis was getting recruited that, Dave Wanstead was willing to sign off, but he wanted to bring Lewis in for a visit and actually see him in person and get an official height and weight to find out exactly how big he is. And the assistants on the staff at the time would joke about how, they might have they brought him in, they got the official height and weight. Dave Wanstead wasn't there to see the scales, and so when they told Dave Wanstead how big Dion Lewis was, they might have exaggerated by an inch or two or maybe a few pounds just to convince him that he was worth taking. Now, obviously, that worked out, but that's sort of an example that some coaches if you're not 5'10", if you're not 5'9", if you're not 195 pounds or something like that, they might automatically disqualify you. And I think there was skepticism about Desmond Reed heading into last year. I think there was skepticism from Pat Narduzzi and maybe other coaches on the staff about whether or not he could really be the kind of back they needed. And what they found out is that he could. And so it's not the worst path to follow. You do wonder about having too many of the same kind of guy. With Reed, Goff, and Turner, you don't have a lot of variety of skill sets. Really, Goff, I think Goff can be really, really good. Reed is obviously accomplished as a ball carrier, at taking handoffs and catching passes. And so you do see that sort of variety of skill set there, or broad set of skills. But you do kind of have the same kind of guy. But if the kind of guy you have, if it's too homogenous in your running back room, but they're all running sub 4.40s, and I don't know if that's the case, that fast, but they've all got speed, then maybe you take that. You take that kind of uniformity if what they're uniform about is their speed. So I'd like to see how the running back depth comes out this week as they're working in pads. How does Ja'Carrion Turner continue his adaptation to college football? How does Juelz Goff work, heading into his second spring camp as he continues to grow and get better? And how does that running back depth come together? It's probably going to be those three guys, Reed, Goff, Turner, unless they go out and get a transfer. So those will be the ones that you're relying on. Now, ideally, everybody stays healthy, and that's not an issue, but chances are you're going to have to go into that depth a little bit. That might mean the running back gets called upon. Speaking of offensive skill positions, this week I'd like to start hearing some positive reports about the wide receivers. There wasn't a lot of talk about receivers last week for, probably for a variety of reasons. But I think this week I'd like to hear the coaches start talking about these guys making an impact. I think the wide receiver group was somewhat underwhelming last year, and there's a variety of factors that goes into that. It's not entirely a reflection on the players. We've talked about how I think Kenny Johnson was criminally underutilized last season. How fondly I think of Konate Mumpfield. I think he's really good and will be really good, and or was really good at Pitt. I'll be interested to see what his NFL career turns out to be. But I think he's really good and played well for Pitt last season. But, kind of beyond those guys, I don't know if you got anything all that exceptional. I think Raphael Williams and Sincerely showed promise at times, but I don't think they ever really capitalized on it or put together the kind of consistent games that you needed out of them. Dejon Reynolds never really got a chance. He made arguably the biggest catch of the season against West Virginia, and that was his first target of the year, and it was the third game of the season. So he was not being used very well. And so I think on the whole, and again, it's not entirely on the receivers that I think the passing game and the play of the receivers was largely underwhelming. I mean, some of that is tied to the quarterback, which is tied to not just the individual throwing the passes, but also the guys tasked with blocking for him. But I think overall, I don't think the receivers really did all that much impressive, and so this year, you obviously need more out of the receiver position than you got. And some of that's going to depend on keeping Eli Holstein healthy and blocking well for him and all of that. But those guys also have to make plays. And I'd like to start hearing this week about those guys making plays. Kenny Johnson needs volume. We know that. I'm going to keep saying that until he gets it. But then what about Raphael Williams? What about the transfers? Andy Jean and Blue Hicks and Deuce Spann? What about Zion Fowler-L and Tyreek Robinson? There are guys, but how good are they? And how much of an impact are they going to make? This week, I'd like to start getting a better sense of that. I think that's one of the big storylines this week. And then sort of along those same lines, what about the tight ends? What are the expectations for the tight ends this season? I don't really know what to expect. And maybe part of it is, I'm just sort of reluctant to set high expectations for the tight ends because I had high expectations for the tight end last year, and Gavin Bartholomew produced largely the same kind of season he had produced for the previous 3 years, which is to say disappointing and underwhelming. And maybe that's on him, maybe that's on the offense, maybe, the scheme or the quarterback or the O-line, whatever it is, he didn't live up to the expectations. Not my expectations, at least. But now Bartholomew's gone. And so you've got Jake Overman, you've got Jake Renda, and you've got Jake Thomas, who goes by Malachi. Not one of those guys has the excitement or the hype level that Gavin Bartholomew had after his freshman season. Now, we know what turned out from those next 3 years. It didn't exactly live up to the excitement or hype level. I don't think Jake Renda is that kind of quarterback or that kind of tight end, although every time he got an opportunity, he seemed to make a play. I think Jake Renda's a really interesting guy who got a lot of hype last spring as having a potentially could fit into this offense well as a big outside receiver, but then he got hurt and never played last season. And Malachi Thomas didn't redshirt, which is notable because they didn't have that many guys on off. I think only two on offense who didn't redshirt. It was Thomas and Tyreek Robinson. And so the coaches obviously liked him enough to put him into that role. What's he ready for as a sophomore? I don't really have a sense of what the expectations are. I mean, I think your priorities in this offense are the running backs and the receivers, particularly Desmond Reed and Kenny Johnson is how I would order them. The tight ends are not necessarily a priority in the offense, but I think there's still they could still do something. And I'm kind of curious of what Cade Bell would like to get out of his tight ends. It's not like they kept him in the block. I mean, when you look at the numbers on Pro Football Focus of what these tight ends were doing, they were running passing routes most of the time. Very rarely did Gavin Bartholomew stay in the block on a pass play. So they're out there. They're not just being used as an extra offensive lineman, but they're not getting the ball. And I understand you got a lot of mouths to feed, but what are the expectations for those tight ends this season? All right, flipping over to the other side of the ball, the defensive ends are going to continue to be interesting. I continue to hear good things about the transfers. Moore and Zielinski and Spires. I think those guys are going to play a big role. Nate Temple's back, which is interesting. You're going to need somebody else to step. Oh, Jimmy Scott is there. I always forget. There's always like one defensive end I forget, and it's Jimmy Scott for some reason. Even though he led the team with 6 sacks last year, led the defensive ends with 6 sacks, and 3 of them came in one game, but he still, had 6 sacks. Double-digit tackles for loss. They're going to need him to build on that season. But I kind of want to see how these defensive ends are coming together. What kind of order are they going to be in? Who's playing together? Who makes for a good pairing? Who seems to bookend well? And who's going to get the most of those snaps? I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it's Scott and Spires, with Zielinski and Moore right behind them. So we're keeping an eye on that this week for sure. And then also on the defense, I'll tell you what I'm looking forward to seeing today. How many stickers are on Cruz Brookins' helmet? All right, Cruz Brookins is going to be a starter this year. He's going to be a starting safety next to Javon McIntyre is my expectation as we sit here on March 18th. That's my expectation is that Cruz Brookins is going to be a starter. And if he is, or when he is, he's going to be getting a ton of reps in practice. Now, he got a lot of work last year in practice as a backup safety, but if he's the number one safety or a first-team safety this year, he's going to get even more reps, which means he's going to get even more opportunities to make plays. And one of the things we always track in spring camp and training camp is the takeaway stickers that they put on the defensive players' helmets. They get a takeaway sticker for every time they force or recover a turnover in practice. And, Cruz Brookins had like 6 or 7 last year in August. I mean, just his helmet was just covered with these stickers. Well, I want to see how many he's got today. They had a pad practice on Saturday. Obviously 2 practices through the week last week. Cruz Brookins, I think it only turned into like 1 interception during the season, but he should be one of the top playmakers on the defense this season, and I'm looking forward to seeing if that gets started, or if it has already started as they move through spring camp. So that's a handful of things I'm thinking about, a handful of things I'm interested in this week. Storylines I think that are prominent and notable this week. I'm thinking we'll write about that stuff today and on Thursday in our spring camp reports. And if you want to make sure you can read those spring camp reports, check out the website, Panther-Lair.com on the 24/7 Sports Network, Panther-Lair.com. We'd love to have you come and check out the site. You might have missed the great promo, but we've got a good one coming up for you, so you'll get a chance to get on for a discount if you are so inclined. We'd love to have you join the site, check out the message boards, and interact with the community and all those things. So go check it out, Panther-Lair.com. And then don't forget to like and subscribe to our video here on YouTube.com/Panther-Lair.com. We appreciate that as always. And yeah, I think that's about it. Stay tuned for lots of coverage from training camp on Panther-Lair.com and right here on YouTube. I hope your week got off to a great start yesterday. We'll catch up with you. Enjoy your Tuesday. We'll catch up with you tomorrow morning for the Morning Pit right here on YouTube.com/Panther-Lair.com.